Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this next seminar in the Tupuna Haumaru seminar series. Today it is very exciting for me to introduce to you Dr. Joel Scanlan. Dr. Scanlan is a senior lecturer at the University of Tasmania. He specialises in cybersecurity and privacy, having undertaken a PhD in the area, and he's been teaching and consulting with industry for 20 years. His primary research interests relate to the technical and social harms of the internet, with particular focus on child exploitation prevention, cybersecurity, and machine learning. His research involves collaborating closely in multiple disciplinary teams, ranging from psychology to the law. He's an active researcher on projects relating to child exploitation prevention, data privacy, maritime cybersecurity, and machine learning. So without anything more from me, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Scanlan now. Really excited to hear this talk.
Thank you very much, and hopefully it's an interesting talk for our audience. It's going to be sort of spanning over quite a few different things, but thank you very much for that introduction. I'm primarily going to be touching on, for the first half, looking at some elements of AI in terms of sort of the opportunities we have, but also the additional problems we're facing with AI, before then sort of pivoting across into a bunch of the research and work that we're doing at UTAS in relation to CSAM deterrence. Before I get into that, I'll just quickly acknowledge the Palau and Pakana people of Lutruwita, the traditional owners and the land upon which I live and work here in Tasmania. We at University of Tasmania stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history. Now, I just had that wonderful introduction outlining everything basically on this slide. But yeah, as I said, I live in Tasmania. I work at the University of Tasmania. I did all three of my degrees here. I've been teaching in cybersecurity basically for about 20 years here, and have sort of pivoted in the last sort of about 8 years, 9 years, I suppose, over into looking at online child exploitation, particularly child sexual abuse material, and looking at deterring and disrupting the sharing of that material. But as I sort of said, this is going to be a bit of a wide-ranging little bit of a presentation going over a bunch of different things, starting off very much sort of looking at an AI perspective on this, before moving into the actual deterrence work that we've done at UTAS, and are continuing to do at the moment. Because we've got a nice broad audience, I am going to just quickly touch on sort of what is the sort of scale of the problem of CSAM, and what we're actually seeing in relation to that. And I'll have a definition of CSAM on the next slide. But if we think about the scale of the problem of child abuse broadly, but also then into the online space as well, we see that 1 in 4 children in Australia, according to a study in 2023, have experienced sexual abuse. It's a bit higher than that for girls and a little bit lower than that for boys. In relation to what we do from a policing perspective in Australia, we have obviously a bunch of states in Australia, and the different law enforcement agencies that sit in those states do work. But also then at a federal level with our Australian Federal Police, we have the ACE, which is the Australian Centre for Countering Child Exploitation, which is based in Brisbane. And that's where a lot of CSAM reports go. And so in the 2023-2024 sort of financial year window, there was 58,500 reports of online child abuse in Australia. That was a 45% increase on the year before. This year's numbers, I don't think are actually public on their website and in reports yet, but they have been sort of mentioned in a bunch of briefings and those sorts of things. And we're looking at about another 40% increase. I think it's 83,000 for the 2024-2025 financial year. If we look globally, we see that NICMAC, based out of the US, their most recent sort of report that came out earlier this year showed that last year, in 2024, they received over 20 million reports of CSAM. And that's coming from lots of big tech providers, for example, So that includes, your Facebooks, your Pornhubs, any sort of online platform that might have videos and images uploaded to it that then do checking and reporting. From that data that's been released, 73,000 of those relate to Australia. And apologies, I probably could have, for that one at least, grabbed the Kiwi numbers, the New Zealand numbers, but I haven't. But that is readily accessible. To consider this now in relation to AI, that same 2024 sort of annual report that came out of probably April of this year showed that generative AI, the number of reports of those within that was a 1,300% increase. So just under 5,000 in 2023 to over 67,000 in 2024. The Internet Watch Foundation in the UK, that does a lot of analysis of reports as well, over the same time period, they reported a 380% increase. And so there's pretty dramatic increases in AI-based CSAM, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this presentation. Again, just another little stat around Australian offending, separate to the victim of stat I gave before. From the offender perspective, in that same survey, there was 1 in 6 Australian males had found an acknowledged experiencing sexual feelings towards children, and 2.5% admitted to actually searching out CSAM, had looked for it, not sort of an accidental exposure to it, but had actually looked to find it. So the CSAM problem is obviously absolutely massive, as you've seen from those numbers on that previous page. CSAM, because I'm going to say that term a lot today in this presentation, refers to any material that depicts or describes, and so text descriptions count as well, describes a child engaged in sexual activity or in a sexual context. And so that's that sort of broad definition there, and that's sort of what I'll be talking about. In our Australian context, and it's the same for New Zealand as well, it's a really serious criminal offence. Creation, distribution, possession, access are all strictly prohibited under lots of laws. And this is pretty much inclusive also of AI-generated content. We are looking at trying to strengthen the laws in relation to AI, but AI-generated content depicting a child in a sexual context is still by definition under the existing laws illegal. In our Australian context, unfortunately for my state, the first person in Australia who was charged over AI-generated material was in March 2024, so a bit over a year ago now. And yeah, just to sort of point that we are actually seeing prosecutions for this sorts of crimes in relation to that. But to sort of move from that sort of very much of a downer in terms of the scale of the problem, can AI actually help us in this space? Can AI assist us in dealing with this? Now, if we look at the sort of problem, we saw those number of cases, 80-odd thousand this year, going to the ACE. Across the country in Australia, there's only actually 20 victim identification specialists. And I think it's actually 18 or 19 at the moment. That number sort of changed a little bit when I was having some conversations with some law enforcement recently. So just from a pure numbers perspective, 80,000 odd reports, 20 specialists. We're fighting a losing battle. This is not a battle we can arrest our way out of. Even that 80,000 sort of cases there, if you were to arrest each of those individuals, it's more than the actual prison population of Australia already. So it's a massive challenge. We need to be doing lots of things in this space. Investigating these crimes separate to the sheer volume are really hard on investigators, high burnout rates. And so AI does actually provide us an opportunity to try to automate some of this work so that investigators don't need to view as much content, have assistance in being more effective in interacting with the content that they do interact with. And so there's investigative support options in relation to AI. Clearview AI is something we've had a lot of discussion about across a few years, and I'm not going to sort of delve into that today. It's got probably some privacy issues, we could say, in terms of how the data was collected in it. But some law enforcement agencies around the world do leverage Clearview AI to use facial recognition to identify victims and offenders, obviously is a way of rapidly getting to conclusions within cases. But separate to that sort of well-known example, there's a fair amount of active research going on around Australia and around the world into using AI in this space. There's some really great work being done in Adelaide. That's what you can see on the right-hand side here, looking across through pictures and video to detect where is the same victim across these different imagery. Is there multiple victims in one photograph, and we can then link them together and try to actually triangulate relationships and those sorts of things. And so that's what you can see on the right-hand side. All those dots are then different videos, and the different coloured lines are referring to whether it's a voice match or a face match, or indeed both, to try and then identify individuals that may be the same across a bunch of content. So instead of an investigator needing to try and do that, getting the AI tool to actually match people up is really a pretty cool approach. The Alex Lab, which is in Melbourne, attached to Monash University, they have projects relating to image localization. And so when there's an image of a child in a hotel room, possibly, it then looks to then say, well, where are these curtains? What kind of couch is it? Can we actually figure out where this hotel room is? There's multiple researchers looking at peer relationships in dark web forums around the world, quite a bit in the Netherlands, Germany, UK, US, and a little bit in Australia as well, looking at trying to establish sort of those social networking groups within dark web forums to identify people. Myself and some others are working with Pathfinder Labs, who are based in New Zealand, looking at seeing if we can do automated psychological monitoring of police investigators. And that sort of project's very much in its early stages, but it is certainly an opportunity to look at, can we fight that burnout of investigators? In terms of CSAM detection, what's CSAM, what is not, there's a bunch of work in that space happening all around the world with multiple teams. Some of this is working tightly with law enforcement to see whether or not they can use some of those data sets of known CSAM to then be able to detect stuff. Other projects, like again, one out of Alex Lab in Melbourne attached to Monash, which is what this cartoon about is on the side here, is actually recruiting a data set from the community of children in non-CSAM photos to be able to then train algorithms to go, this is CSAM, this is not, and really sort of establishing that not data set through people submitting images to train the AI, so that the AI is then being trained ethically and responsibly as to what's happening there. Grooming detection is an area of active research in multiple countries, and quite a bit within large platforms. A lot of messaging platforms have grooming detection these days. It's very proprietary. It's kept in-house, and us lowly researchers don't get to know much about it, other than they're getting alerts to some degree. But there are research projects in that space as well. Deterrence messaging, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit here, is stuff that's actively being researched. Use of chatbots. The chatbot on the right-hand side here is a project I did with the E-Safety Commissioner, more around providing adolescents with information when they're trying to actually get help, to more victim and bystander focused. But there are a bunch of automated approaches to detection and response, and I'll talk more about those in the sort of second half of this presentation. But how is AI making it worse? We just heard about all these wonderful tools that can help us detect CSAM, respond to CSAM, investigate CSAM, but AI itself is actually making our problem much harder. We're seeing cases of CSAM imagery being generated from images on social media. A case review a month or two ago about an offender in the UK who'd been basically for hire producing AI CSAM based on submitted images that people would pay for. And so it was sorts of scenarios where, like, a stepfather would send in some pictures of their stepkids to them have CSAM generated by this guy, and he was selling pictures for like £100 a pop sort of situation. And so we see this sort of thing being done. So CSAM being created of children who haven't actually been abused, but this is imagery of them in scenarios that didn't occur. We also have AI-based imagery of sort of known CSAM that's been around, could be in these sort of well-known series that have been circling the internet for a couple of decades, and then offenders are now creating new items in that series based on a victim who was abused, a decade ago. And so that's then often they get notifications saying, look, there's more imagery of you going around. It's not even anything that you experienced, but it's now looks like you experienced this thing, even though it's AI generated. And so that's obviously re-traumatizing victims. It's, again, increasing the amount of content out there, all of which is sort of really problematic. The third one here, which we hear people go, oh, it's fully synthetic. There's no child that's been harmed. That's really sort of a false argument, in my opinion. We do have fully synthetic CSAM being made of effectively, fully fake children. But what we do see in that space is we then have law enforcement investigating, because they can't tell if it's AI or not. So they're then trying to locate a child that doesn't exist. So we're then taking valuable investigation time away from actual cases. We're growing the CSAM market by this more. So it's also then creating a greater market for CSAM, which then means more children are being affected. And fully synthetic CSAM is usually not actually fully synthetic in the sense that it's often trained on existing CSAM. And so it's using this abuse imagery to then train things. We have LLMs, which we all love to use, ChatGPT, to help us do things. Unfortunately, offenders are doing that to generate grooming scripts, asking it how to talk like a 12-year-old, how to talk like a 13-year-old, those sorts of things, which makes things obviously dramatically worse as groomers can become more effective. There was a really interesting event that occurred last year. It's interesting to researchers like me, perhaps, but not everyone else. And a report's actually just come out today, and I've put a link into the chat to a PDF of a report of basically 500 schools in South Korea, which were basically targeted with deepfakes. Now, most of these were actually done by their peers, lots of 12 and 13-year-olds producing imagery of their classmates. Now, I'll mention in the next slide, we've got examples of this occurring in other countries, but what happened in South Korea was basically like industrial scale version of this, with 500 schools being targeted, highly organised. Chatbots on Telegram were used to automate the process. And so if you joined a channel and sort of followed a chatbot, which is one that's being shown on the right-hand side at the bottom, when you first signed up to that chatbot, you got your first 2 images for free. And then after that, it was sort of about 50 cents for each follow-up image. And so what we then saw is thousands and thousands of images made of students at schools. Some of the schools had 2,000 odd members following them and producing imagery about the children at those schools, often based off of their Instagram photos or the school yearbook and all those sorts of things. The piece of Korean, the text that's in the middle on the right-hand side, is actually taken from a school yearbook in Korea last year, where every single page of the yearbook then had this line that says creating deepfake imagery is a crime. Kind of depressing to then have schools know that they need to put that kind of thing in their school yearbook to dissuade people from creating deepfakes of their students. So 80% of those arrested doing this were teenagers. There was even some offenders in elementary schools. So they were younger than the age 12, but I believe the average age was, I think, something like 12.9 years of age. And this is all automated, all through AI chatbots in channels on Telegram. But if you want more information, I put that link in the chat. There's actually a conversation article that's going to come out about this. It's sitting with the editor at the moment. It'll be out probably in a couple of hours, probably. And so that'll appear online, diving into it. That South Korean crisis, to me, is important for us to learn from, because when we, particularly Australia and New Zealand, look to Japan, look to South Korea, we're often looking into our future. They're more digitally sort of along that sort of digital adoption trajectory than we are. And so we see lots of cool things in Japan often, and then we get it 5 years later. This is one we don't want to get, but we do already see Notify apps in schools. I've spoken to police in Tasmania, and a number of schools have had to visit about this. We've had a bunch of high-profile cases across Australia. I assume there's probably been some cases that have made the news in New Zealand as well. And so that's obviously then seeing a lot of that peer-on-peer offending. But we also see organised sexual extortion gangs using it online as well, where they're effectively sort of chatting to a child, sending them a fake picture of themselves, and then try to get them to send money or to send more imagery, and blackmailing them. And so the sexual extortion issues we've been seeing across the last 3 or 4 years are getting exacerbated by AI because it's provided them with an additional tool. So what can we do? It's a lot of things we need to do. I'm barely going to scratch the surface here. In our Australian context, we've got an Online Safety Act review coming up. I think a key part of this is around our online platforms and the proposal for a duty of care for tech platforms to provide safe systems. How that rolls out, whether that gets implemented, what those rules are, to me is sort of a bit of an open question, but I think that's an opportunity. But separate to that, we need a societal-wide response around education. A lot of the offending I've mentioned have been young people. So we need to educate our young people better around what is okay and what's not okay. We see CSAM being made, obviously, by lots of adults in other contexts. We need to shrink the offender pool. We need to make sure that they realise it's a crime, that they're going to get caught, all those sorts of elements. But that education piece also is for then bystanders as well, making sure that we're reporting things that we see, all those sorts of things, and indeed for victims as well. So this is a big change, a big tectonic shift we see with what AI can do in all aspects of our lives, and the kind of harms it can do are really important that we're across. For people who are interested, there is a Safer AI Coalition for Children that was sort of broadly Australian-based, although the person who's leading it currently lives in New Zealand, who's the CEO of ICMEC Australia, lives in New Zealand currently. He's about to move. So feel free to scan that QR code to learn about that. Although that Safer AI Coalition for Children will actually have a website launching in... I'm not sure what the exact timeline is, but I'd probably say a month, maybe it's 6 weeks. A key part of our societal response is calling on government to do things like I did mention. And a couple of weeks ago, 17th of July, as you can see on this, there was an AI roundtable in Canberra in Australia where a bunch of us got together to talk through this issue, which then did result in some of us ending up on TV, which I'll skip right past. But what we did see on Monday this week was actually a bill being put forward in Australian Parliament to actually add additional offences for the creation of AI tools that generate CSAM with stiffer penalties sort of being intended there, because obviously, as I said before, having AI generated CSAM is already a crime, but collecting material to train and produce a model should be a much, much stronger offence than just simply having an image, for example, because you're facilitating the creation of it, and that's what that bill is. And so we can see responses from government, and I think that's a key piece of this. And so I'm going to stop and shift there across to deterrence efforts and the kind of research that we do at UTAS. What I've spoken about so far is the harm of AI, the sort of advantages we can get from AI, and the sort of CSAM problem as a whole. The deterrence efforts that we're looking at doing at UTAS and are working with a bunch of partners that I'll talk about is trying to add more friction, to make it harder for people to offend or to find content online. The offender pool has grown dramatically with the internet. The number of people are sharing CSAM prior to the internet would have been really small. There was sort of magazines and a few things like that, but the number of offenders in that context was pretty small numbers. The online, it's just absolutely exploded. And so the kind of work that we do at UTAS is looking at how can we nudge people away from this, inform them of the harm, all those sorts of things. And so that's what we're looking at. Now, if we look at other contexts, we can see that warning messages play a really key role in other public health things or in relation to finance and a whole range of different things. Whether we're talking on the side of the road as we're driving along, whether we're talking on the side of a medicine bottle saying keep out of the reach of children, that's actually a warning message directed at bystanders to protect another group. These things aren't massively solving things. I mean, I've got a couple of speeding tickets in my life, so clearly I wasn't paying much attention to those speed signs at that time. Generally, I do, I promise. But having those warning messages in place obviously does have a pretty big safety impact. It doesn't solve things. It's not a silver bullet that magically fixes everything. But it reduces the amount of offending. It reduces the amount of harm or safety issues that relate in all these other contexts. And in the context of the internet, we've got sort of growing, maybe about 20 years of work in looking at the effectiveness of warning messages and reminders and things across things in relation to online and computers and whatnot. And if we look at CSAM, Richard Wortley, who obviously has a position at Waikato, has done landmark work there and works in our team at UTAS as well. And from a situational crime prevention lens, the idea of having warning messages as a situational crime prevention tool in CSAM is an idea that's been around now for about 15 years due to Richard and Stephen Smallbone's work. From that, we can see that interacting with and interviewing offenders that have reported that warning messages can actually disrupt use. A lot of CSAM offenders have tried to stop, have sought help. And so warning messages can serve as a nudge there to direct them over to support services and those sorts of things to try and change those behaviours. But if we look at other work, what we see is that CSAM use is actually a really broad offender base. It's not just people that can be formally diagnosed as being pedophiles. It's actually a much bigger group than that. We have a lot of CSAM offending that's in the minor category. Obviously, in that Korean case, what we see is loads and loads of 13-year-olds generating images of their peers. All of these things make this a pretty complex offender base for thinking about what's actually there. However, what we do have, one real big benefit we do have in relation to warning messages, and I've clearly got a mistake there by having the same title in that left-hand column twice in a row, is that CSAM prevention messages can be cheap. Warning messages online basically cost tech providers nothing. They already have the infrastructure to deliver the content. Putting a warning message in that space can have a really wide impact at a really low cost. And so, yeah, it's not going to be a silver bullet that solves the problem, but it can be a way to actually try to shrink that offender pool, put out key messaging, signposting to support services and other things to try and direct people. And so off the back of that sort of landmark work by Stephen Smallbone and Richard Wortley, we then did see about 10 years ago, it was actually 2013. It was written up in 2015, but it was 2013. We see Google, Bing, and Yandex all actually released warning messages on their search engines. So if people searched for terms related to CSAM, they would then get a warning message. In 2015, Chad Steele wrote up a paper looking at what happened to that search volume, looking at what publicly available through Google's own sort of search API across 100 sort of terms related to CSAM, and saw dramatic drops in the frequency of those searches once warning messages were activated. And what we see now there on the left-hand side at the top is the current warning message that's displayed on Google. Down the bottom there on the left-hand side is what we see in Facebook in terms of them doing it as well. So we see social media companies are also doing this. But unfortunately, these large tech companies that are putting these messages in place, which is great, have not actually said exactly much about what volume's occurring, how often people click on them, all those sorts of things. Very little data on the number of searches or indeed the successful nature of these interventions. There is possibly more of that coming along now. There certainly seems to be some movement, particularly from Google, around wanting to talk more about this. And so we're pretty curious to see what's happening there. But in the intervening time, there's been a bunch of experiments looking at, well, are these effective? And this is where the UTAS part of this story picks up. Off the back of the work that Richard did, we started collaborating with him, looking at, can we actually test these? And so we ran a series of actually 3 randomized control experiments where we set up a honeypot website that was sort of saying it had something that was CSAM or CSAM-like. The first version of the honeypot was advertising barely legal pornography. So yeah, not actually CSAM. From an ethics perspective, we can't actually set up a fake CSAM website because there was actually no actual pornography there either. It was just a landing page that was fake that we got an advertising company to set up for us. But it was the warning messages were all clear, saying that some of these actors are 18 or may appear younger. And if they appear younger, that then hits into the CSAM definition. And so we ran 3 experiments. The second honeypot we set up was actually looking at sharing imagery. And so that was really around that non-consensual sharing piece where the website was purporting to be, if you upload content, you get access to other content. And that non-consensual sharing is also a crime, and it's image-based abuse versus CSAM. And so across these experiments, we found that they were effective at dissuading users from continuing on to the websites when they receive the warning. Pretty strong statistical significance in terms of the deterrence effect. So warning messages do actually disrupt that offending behaviour. And so off the back of those 3 experiments, we then published a bunch of evidence, which is now some of the key evidence that gets used by regulators to actually justify warning messages as a key tool. When we're talking about a duty of care possibly coming in Australia and talking about things like safety by design in this sort of context, warning messages are one of those sort of key examples that fit into that sort of piece to nudge people away from offending in online platforms. But these were very small. They were randomized control experiments, 500 participants in each one. If we look at something like a Google or a Bing, they've got millions and millions of users and indeed other platforms. And so off the back of this, there was then the first in the wild sort of evaluation of a warning message, and you can see the warning message there in the background. This is on Pornhub, which has been rolled out globally, but also in this image you can see a chatbot popping up, and this is the reThink chatbot, which is live in the UK and is possibly going to appear in some other jurisdictions in the not too distant future. But this was an evaluation of people who entered in a search term on Pornhub that related to CSAM, which then triggers off this warning saying that it doesn't exist there. Pornhub very much is of the opinion that they don't have CSAM. They certainly have historically, as it's been noted by New York Times and others and several court cases. But they've certainly, I think we can say, lifted their game in recent years. And within that industry, they're probably the one that's doing the most, but probably off the back of those court cases and New York Times articles and things have resulted in some of that motivation. But we very much applaud them for their work and indeed collaborating and then sharing with us the data on whether this is effective or not. And so within the reThink project, we were able to then access sort of the data on how many searches occurred, how they interacted with the chatbot, whether they then click through to stop it now to get help. And so across the sort of evaluation window of March 2022 to August 2023, there was 2.8 million searches for CSAM on Pornhub in the UK. In a period that came just before that, where it was just sort of the warning message without the chatbot, there was another 2.2 million. So across the entire window from sort of mid-2021 through to August 2023, there was 4.4 million warnings displayed on Pornhub. And so, again, I just want to highlight that, yeah, Bing and Google have had warning messages since 2013, and we have no idea on the numbers of warnings or their effectiveness. And yet we do have Pornhub coming to the table and sharing this data, enabling us to then go, well, do these actually work? And so from that data, there was a statistically significant reduction on search volume for those terms across that period. And so we can see that line going down. The chatbot was disabled for a period at the end, and we did see that the warning as a whole became less effective at that point. The warning message was still active, but it was just the warning message alone without the chatbot. And we saw there was a sort of a rebound in search volume as a result of that. So the warning message was having a reductive effect, and then also the chatbot was then making that effect even stronger. For users who actually saw a warning message, 81% did not actually then search again for CSAM on Pornhub. They didn't leave the site. They were still there. They did other searches. They watched videos. They were more likely to watch content, less likely to search than other users on the site. But they certainly still searched. They certainly still watched videos. They didn't sort of get the warning and then shut the browser window. They remained on the site for the most part. And so 80% of sessions not then searching for CSAM is a good sort of highlight of the effectiveness of that of deterring activity. If we compare the 3 Julys that are in our data set, because obviously July 2023, the chatbot was disabled, we can see that there was a significant effect across the first year of it being active, from warning message to the chatbot being active. And then when the chatbot was deactivated, it then showed that the search volume returned. And so the warning was actually being effective at dissuading people from searching for CSAM. What you can see, though, on this graph on the far left-hand side is that really low percentage. And so I want to just highlight that actually what we found in our study was that 99.8% of sessions on Pornhub in the UK did not contain a search that actually triggered the warning. The vast majority of users on Pornhub don't actually search for CSAM, which is encouraging, obviously. It probably also does highlight that a lot of people probably don't go to Pornhub looking for CSAM. They might go other places, dark web, peer-to-peer networks, lots of other things. A very much definitionally mainstream pornography site is possibly not where they're expecting to find CSAM. However, 4.4 million searches across an 18-month window means that, no, there are still plenty of people that are going to Pornhub to look for CSAM. I haven't included the search terms they've used here. They are available in some papers I've written about this. We've sort of showed some of those. I include, I think, in that sort of report and paper, 10 terms that were probably among the top 15 terms used. I did sort of not use a couple of them in the public reporting. They were unambiguous. These weren't false triggers. They were 100% looking for CSAM. There was no ambiguity in them. So 99.8% not looking for CSAM, but there still was 2.8 million that were. From those, and looking at the chatbot interactions, there were 1,600 sessions where people were interacting with the chatbot and then they requested help, of which about 500 clicked on the support links from the chatbot through to Stop It Now. More others clicked on through from the warning message itself, but we were evaluating just the chatbot within this study. There were 68 callers who voluntarily said that they actually interacted with the chatbot when they called Stop It Now. People who called Stop It Now were not asked, did you see a chatbot? Did you interact with Pornhub or anything? That was not being asked. These people just happened to volunteer, and it was noted down by the people receiving the calls, which is great to hear that the people were actually going all the way through and calling and getting help. So just to finish up here, what we've seen with those examples is there's been the RCTs, there's been the experiments that were done. We've seen the work with Pornhub to actually show that, yes, it had a strong impact on a mainstream big internet service with millions of users and actually deterring people looking for CSAM. And so this is where we want to continue to do more work in this space, to look at doing warning messages in lots of different contexts, to add friction, to make it harder for people to locate CSAM and interact with it and sort of develop those sorts of behaviours. And so from a prevention lens, primary prevention is our normal sorts of ways of doing public health messaging. That's sort of what primary prevention is. So, signs on bus stops, on TV ads and education in schools, that's primary prevention. Secondary prevention is what we've been doing here, where someone's at risk of committing a crime of some type. They're entering in a search term that relates to CSAM. Very much a secondary prevention approach is what warning messages are. And then tertiary is what we see in other contexts where someone's actually in therapy or whatnot. Online, we've got lots of possibilities of interventions in lots of places. There's a lot of opportunities. I'm not going to explain this slide in much more depth than that, but to say warning messages and other ways of adding friction to make it harder to offend online, there's actually quite a few options in front of us. It doesn't just need to be with big tech either. This can be with schools and universities, hotel chains, airports, free Wi-Fi, lots of contexts where things like someone attempts to access a banned URL because it's known to contain CSAM. If they attempt to access that URL, showing them a warning message, that can happen in any sort of context. And so we've written up an article about this as well, around how to put warning messages in lots of different spots online to try and add friction there. Now, off the back of this, I'm going to talk briefly about two different initiatives before we jump to questions. One is in the UK, which is Project Intercept, which has been running since 2023, led by Lucy Faithfull Foundation, who operate Stop It Now in the UK. Stop It Now being a helpline for people of those who are concerned about their interest in children. They've currently have active interventions with more than 10 partners. I'm listing a bunch of them here on the left-hand side that are sort of publicly known about. Obviously, Google is where their sort of warning message that they put in 2013, that sort of evolved into now, when that warning message appears, it points over to Lucy Faithfull. And that's been that case for a decade or more. The same with Facebook and Instagram. I've already sort of mentioned Pornhub within this presentation, but OnlyFans is someone they work with. The Internet Watch Foundation they work quite closely with, which means they end up working with ISPs when people attempt to access things. They're also looking at working with dating companies, AI companies. And so at the moment, the current monthly average is 30,000 users go to the Stop It Now website in the UK as a result of clicking on a warning message. So per month, 30,000 people clicking on warning messages in the UK going straight to Stop It Now, which is a really great outcome from warning messages. What's about to happen or in the process of happening is in Australia, we're setting up a thing called the CSAM Deterrence Centre. It's a partnership between the University of Tasmania and Stop It Now Australia, which is operated by Jesuit Social Services. This is a $1 million research centre that's been established to work with tech companies to evaluate warning messages, do awareness campaigns, educational resources, a whole range of different things. Those educational resources are more for the tech industry themselves, equipping them to be able to do warning messages that are effective. We're not jumping in on the educational resources for lots of other settings that already have other NGOs in those spaces. Our website, which hopefully will be live by like Monday next week, but maybe it'll be a few more days, is csamdeterrence.com. It doesn't work at the moment, but that is coming very soon.